Welcome back to the Midnight Historian. I'm Lawrance Pembroke, your guide through the darker, dustier corners of history. Tonight, what if I told you the life of a knight was far less glamorous than you've been led to believe? Beneath the shining armor and battlefield bravado, it was mostly rust, rot, and regret. So, stoke the fire, wrap up warm, and join me as we discover why it thoroughly sucked to be a medieval knight. What if everything you thought you knew about knights was a lie? Forget the shining armor and noble quests. Being a medieval knight was a grueling, often thankless existence. From scrubbing chamber pots as a page to risking your life for a knight who barely knew your name, this was no glamorous calling. So, how did they endure the endless pain and struggle? The truth is far darker than the legends ever tell. Imagine being a child barely old enough to understand the world and being told you'd have to leave it all behind. 7 years old, maybe 8, and already your parents were steering you toward a future that was neither your choice nor your understanding. One morning, you're packed off to a castle far from home, not for the heroic adventures you might have heard in bedtime stories, but to serve. It was a moment meant to set you on the path to knighthood, but it felt nothing like the beginning of something great. The castle loomed cold and unwelcoming as you stepped through its gates, your small hands clutching whatever belongings you had been allowed to keep. Any childhood notions of grandeur you might have carried were soon replaced by confusion, loneliness, and the sheer weight of what lay ahead. Being a page wasn't a title to boast about. It was a grind, a boot camp for the unprepared. Your days were consumed by tasks that seemed endless, unimportant, and exhausting. Fetch water, sweep the floors, empty chamber pots full of the Lord's wrath from the previous night's feasting. The glamorous halls of the castle were your workplace, and despite the intricate tapestries or the high stone ceilings, you were always aware of your place. You were a servant first and foremost, cleaning up after the very knights you aspired to become. It wasn't just labor, but a complete shift in everything you knew. Gone was your family's warm hearth, along with the comfort of your mother's voice or the playfulness of siblings. In its place, rigid structure and the skepticism of strangers governed your life. And make no mistake, this was a harsh existence. The adults saw you as more of a tool than a child. You were there to work, to observe and to obey without question. Slipping up often earned you a sharp critique, at best. At worst, lashes across your hands, or if your misstep was considered serious enough, harsher beatings. Discipline wasn't so much taught as it was imposed physically and emotionally. The ideal knight was one who could endure, and that training began early. Did you dream of battles or feasts? Those fantasies quickly shattered under the weight of your wooden training sword, barely more than a stick, which you were ordered to swing until your arms burned too much to lift it anymore. Think about this. You weren't even really a person to most of the castle residents. Lords and knights greeted each other with dignity. Pages, however, slipped in and out of rooms unnoticed, like shadows. You might silently pass through banquets to refill goblets or stand in the drafty great hall waiting for hours in case you were called upon. Your presence was a convenience, not a point of importance. And yet, invisibility didn't mean you could escape punishment if you failed to perform every duty perfectly. The pressure to anticipate their wants before they were spoken often felt crushing. When the training began in earnest, it wasn't the romantic mentorship you might imagine. Knights didn't sit you down with wise advice or recount their tales to inspire you. No, they expected you to mimic, to learn through mistakes, and of course to endure pain. Swinging those wooden swords might have been a mercy compared to other days spent carrying heavy loads, balancing trays of delicate but heavy dishes during meals, or being yanked from sleep because someone decided the fire needed stoking. Rest was a privilege, not a guarantee, and there was little reprieve from the fatigue. By nightfall, collapsing onto the straw mat that passed for bedding was less about sleep and more about your body giving out. Still, between aching limbs and blistered hands, there was something that kept you going. Once in a while, during those long hours you worked in the kitchen or tidied the great hall, you'd catch the soft strains of a minstrel's ballad drifting through the castle walls. Their words spoke of bravery, chivalry, and knights who captured imaginations with their deeds. Or maybe, as you crept down dim corridors at night, the sight of a gleaming suit of armor on display teased a flicker of ambition. Not every page believed they would make it to become one of those figures, but the tiniest shred of hope was enough to keep some alive and moving forward. After all, wasn't every page's dream that one day they might feel the cold steel of a knight's sword tapping both their shoulders in a dubbing ceremony? But these moments of light didn't shield you from reality. Most pages felt more like tools of labor than trainees destined for greatness. They weren't budding warriors, at least not yet. They were maids, errand boys, and low-ranking servants who lived in the background, unheard and uncelebrated. For many, knighthood wasn't even a guarantee. Some would wash out long before then, sent back home in disgrace, forgotten once they passed through the castle gates for the last time. Others simply wouldn't survive the years of toil, whether it was illness, injury, or sheer exhaustion that claimed them. And yet for those who endured, that glimmer of knighthood still dangled in the distance. The idea that one could endure the suffering, climb from obscurity, and someday earn the respect of lords and kings. That was the thread that pulled them through the drudgery. They kept scrubbing, kept running errands, kept fighting through gritted teeth. They were told that pain was temporary. Glory lasted forever. A lie, perhaps, but one they couldn't afford to stop believing. When the day finally came to cast off the title of page and step into the life of a squire, any lingering sense of relief would have been short-lived. If you thought things were hard now, they were about to become immeasurably worse. As a squire, you'd be pulled even deeper into the life of servitude, tethered directly to the knight you were bound to serve. The responsibilities grew heavier, the punishments harsher, and the dangers far more real. Surviving as a page was an accomplishment, but it was only a taste of what was to come. At 14, the moment arrived, the day you would shed the title of page and become a squire. It sounded like a triumph, a step closer to wearing the armor you'd admired since childhood. But this so-called promotion came with a jarring reality. It wasn't a reward, it was a shift into something even more grueling. You were no longer just a servant in the background. Now you were tethered to a knight, his shadow in every waking moment and at times his lifeline. The transition came with bruises, broken sleep, and a heavy sense of responsibility that far outweighed anything you had known so far. As a squire, you felt the weight of knighthood not through titles or glory, but through the iron and steel you now carried every day. Armor maintenance became your daily ritual. Each piece, breastplates, gauntlets, pauldrons, had to gleam like perfection, free from any defect that could mean disaster in battle. But these weren't smooth, pristine objects from a modern museum. Armor was a collection of moving parts, a place where dirt and sweat accumulated in hinges and grooves. You spent countless hours polishing it down to the smallest rivet, your hands red and raw from scrubbing, knowing that missing a single detail might mean disaster for your knight, or for you. A visor that clogged with grime during combat could be the difference between life and death, and if it failed, no one would blame the armor. They'd blame you. But preparation didn't stop in the armory. You were also tasked with overseeing war horses, temperamental, massive beasts bred for sheer power and endurance. Riding them wasn't just difficult, it was a physical test all its own. These weren't animals that responded gracefully to a gentle tug of the reins. They were unpredictable, capable of throwing you to the ground in an instant, testing both your patience and strength. The effort to mount one, let alone control its explosive energy, left your legs aching and your spine jarring with every heavy step. Falling became routine, and the bruises that came with it were considered part of learning. Still, there was no room for fear. A horse like this was not just a mode of transport, it was a weapon in itself, carrying the immense momentum a knight relied upon in battle. Your job was to master it, or mask the failure if you couldn't. Your training as a squire wasn't just about mastering skills, but also about enduring the unrelenting physical punishment that came with it. Sparring evolved into something deadlier. The wooden swords you knew as a page were replaced with steel. These blades weren't sharpened to kill, but they were real enough to cut or bruise severely. Every sparring session left you aching, sometimes bleeding. For every successful parry, you'd take 3 hits, each like a hammer blow against your muscles. It wasn't uncommon to limp away from training sessions only to be expected back at it the next day. The goal wasn't finesse, it was endurance. A knight wasn't expected to dance through battle, but to push past pain and exhaustion, and so were you. Beyond the bruises and harsh lessons, there was the constant emotional pressure of your new role. You'd imagined the thrill of riding alongside a knight in battle, but the reality was something far darker. In war, you carried not only your knight's provisions and weapons, but also a responsibility far larger than yourself. When a knight fell, or worse, was unhorsed, it was your job to run into the chaos and retrieve him. Picture this, dragging a fully armored man, weighing as much as 2 grown soldiers thanks to steel plates, across a muddy battlefield while arrows rained down around you. Squires weren't expected to fight in battle, but the danger didn't skip over them. You ran headfirst into bloodied chaos whenever your knight needed you to. Then there were the tournaments, which in theory were a celebration of chivalry, but often felt like a rehearsal for war. The preparation alone was grueling. Saddling horses, lacing armor, carrying lances. It all fell on you. If your knight performed well, you might earn a moment of pride collecting his winnings. But if he fell from his horse or took a lance to the shoulder, it was your job to pull him out of harm's way before the next blow landed. Watching knights collide with sheer force during tournament jousts was awe-inspiring in stories, but in real life it left broken bones and sometimes worse. The colorful pageantry of banners and cheers couldn't hide the reality for squires who saw not honor, but broken faces and shattered ribs up close. But it wasn't just tournaments or battlefields. Every day carried its own brutal lessons. Squires were taught to suppress pain, fear, even humanity itself. Your knight's survival hinged on your unflinching ability to react, to think clearly under pressure, and to keep working no matter how bad things became. Show fear in front of a commanding knight, and you'd earn not sympathy, but reprimand. You were taught to recognize the flicker of fear that could sharpen reflexes, but you had to suppress the kind that froze your muscles or made you hesitate. This mental training was constant, carving into you a resilience that felt almost unnatural for someone your age. And all the while, you were still a teenager. Just a boy struggling to keep up with the life of a man. The things you saw, the injuries you treated, the time spent in hopeless, sleepless marches, they aged you faster than anyone back home would ever believe. When you weren't on duty, you were expected to continue your training or handle the administrative tasks your knight couldn't bother with. Stewardship barely left you time to think, let alone dream about the knighthood you were supposedly inching closer toward, and the few who remained pages, too young or unlucky to advance. Now look to you as an example. You were tasked with passing on what knowledge and strength you had already gained, even if it felt like you were barely holding yourself together. And yet, as much as it broke you down, there was always the hope, however faint, that this life would lead somewhere. One day you might shed the bruises and the raw palms and kneel before your lord or king to be dubbed a knight. But for many squires that moment never came. Some fell to disease after exhausting campaigns. Others suffered injuries that ended careers before they even truly began. And war could claim you before you ever got the chance to distribute your first blow in battle. Becoming a knight was never a guarantee. It was a distant dream, and not everyone was lucky enough to reach it. Even still, for those who made it, the life of a knight was no fairy tale. For all the labor and sacrifice as a squire, the reality of knighthood presented an entirely new set of struggles. Was it ever really worth it? That was a question many knights would spend the rest of their lives trying to answer. The knight's battlefield, where chivalry died. Picture a knight charging into battle. The banners ripple in the wind, the sunlight gleams against polished armor, and courage seems to swell in the air. That's how the songs tell it, at least. But the battlefield reality was nothing like that. Instead, it was a cacophony of screams, the choking stench of blood and mud, and the grim task of fighting to stay alive. Knights prided themselves on chivalry, but in the chaos of medieval warfare, survival stripped away ideals and left behind something far dirtier. A knight's role in war might seem simple in its purpose, charging the enemy with strength and precision, but in practice, it was unbearably brutal. Even before the fighting started, every step forward was a reminder of just how exhausted your body already was. The armor, weighing up to 60 pounds, clung to you like an iron cage as you trudged across uneven terrain. Underneath, your padded undergarments were soaked with sweat before the first blows were even exchanged. Each heartbeat drummed faster as you neared the clash, every muscle braced for the impact that might become your last. And then, the charge began. It wasn't a measured affair, like the turn-based jousts knights practiced in tournaments. No, this was raw chaos, the ground trembling from the thunder of countless hooves tearing it apart, the screams of men and animals colliding over the relentless hum of orders shouted to deaf ears. Knights who thought they would fight with honor and precision quickly learned there was no such thing as an elegant battle. Horses stumbled and fell, dragging riders into the dirt, where they became sitting targets. Blades swung wildly in the fray, rarely finding the clean arcs they were trained for. Armor clashed against armor as knights desperately hacked and thrust, their lungs struggling for air beneath constricting helmets. And falling for a knight meant more than simply landing on the ground. It could be a death sentence. Once unhorsed, your life was measured by seconds, how fast you could scramble to your feet before a blade found you, or whether your squire could reach you in time. For the squire, this moment was nothing short of a nightmare. Imagine dragging a man weighed down by full-plate armor across a battlefield that churned with mud and blood while the air filled with the whir of arrows overhead. The squire's hands, often already stiff and tired from carrying supplies all morning, clung to armor straps, pulling desperately as the chaos swirled around them. If they succeeded, it might buy the knight another chance to fight. If they didn't, both of them were likely finished. This raw, grim energy extended far beyond the fighting itself. Medieval warfare was not just about two armies meeting on an open field. Villages didn't stand unscathed when armies passed through. They were looted, burned, and torn apart. Knights, who were meant to uphold honor and protect the weak, were often the very agents of destruction. The romantic vision of chivalry clashed horribly with the need to survive. Whether torching buildings to deprive the enemy of resources or rounding up prisoners not for mercy but for ransom money, knights had to prioritize pragmatism over principles. Honor gave way to necessity, and those lofty ideals, mercy, bravery, the protection of the innocent, often found themselves conveniently ignored. The battlefield wasn't merely a physical test, it also took an enormous toll on the mind. After the screams faded and the dust began to settle, knights were left to confront the aftermath of their deeds. The silence following a battle was often more haunting than the noise within it. Survivors trudged across the field to count losses, stepping around the fallen, some dead, some clinging to life. Squires often followed their knights during this grim walk, tasked now with tending to wounds or finishing off those who begged for a swifter end than nature would allow. The battlefield, littered with broken bodies and shattered weapons, was a reminder that no one left untouched, even if they survived. For some knights, this reality buried itself deep in their psyche. The songs of victory they grew up with rang hollow in the face of what they had seen. Ballads rarely mentioned the cries of dying men, the terrified faces of villagers, or the ways chivalry was abandoned in the heat of war. And so knights carried their scars, misshapen joints from poorly healed wounds, lingering infections from gashes they couldn't fully treat in the field, and a mind that wrestled with what it meant to kill to survive. While the church told them their actions were righteous, or at least excusable, the weight was theirs alone to carry when they marched back toward home. For the squire, things weren't much better. They glimpsed the same horrors, felt the same exhaustion, and carried the same fears, only without the slim privilege of calling themselves knights. They learned quickly that no one was immune to death's grasp. The knight they followed, the figure they were supposed to emulate, was just as fragile as anyone else when an arrow pierced their armor at the wrong angle. Watching everything play out from the edge of the fighting, or in its very heart if they had to rescue their knight, meant they saw the truth of battle long before they were ever meant to experience it firsthand. By the time they donned armor of their own, the idea of glory was often a hollow concept, replaced by grim determination to simply endure the next fight. So what did knights leave behind on the battlefield? Not the image of noble heroes riding to certain triumph, but scars, the kind that marked them in every way possible. Deep gashes across leathery skin, aching joints that remembered the weight of armor long after it had been removed, and the darker scars no one could see. Those proclamations of honor carved into old stone castles, those told one story. The knights who had actually been there, who had survived the mud, the chaos, and the screams, could tell you another. But here was the dilemma every knight faced. How could they reconcile the life of war and violence with the ideals of chivalry they were meant to live by every day? Was chivalry truly something to aspire to, or had it always been a myth, a mask for a reality far too brutal to sing about? Even when they weren't in battle, the weight of those contradictions followed them back home. 5. The fragile myth of chivalry. It's the word that defines our image of knights, isn't it? A knight in shining armor riding to defend the weak, safeguard virtue, and uphold justice. At least that's what the stories tell us. But this so-called code of chivalry, this lofty moral compass, was always more of an ideal than a reality. It was a framework built on noblesse oblige, on the belief that those granted power and privilege would use it wisely to serve others. Yet, in practice, it was far less about kindness or protection, and far more about appearances and control. The code itself was rooted in Christian values and established as a way to civilize knights, who were essentially trained killers. Feudal loyalty underpinned their existence, and chivalry offered a way to graft morality onto violence. Knights were meant to defend the church, show mercy to their enemies, and protect the helpless, a noble set of goals, at least on paper. The ideals painted a picture of virtue and selflessness, of warriors who fought rightly, not just for glory or plunder. But in reality, these principles were as flexible as a reed in the wind, bent by the demands of war, greed, and survival. Take the rule that knights should protect the weak. Sounds admirable, doesn't it? Until you realize that this protection often depended on who the weak were. Noble women, especially those with wealth or connections, could expect such treatment. Grand gestures, even poetry extolling their purity and worth. But for common women or villagers, the knight's sword often brought more fear than safety. These people weren't shielded. More often, they were collateral damage. A village suspected of hiding supplies or harboring dissent could be looted or razed, its inhabitants left to starve or scatter. Protecting the weak wasn't a universal principle. It had conditions, loopholes, and exceptions. Even the church, supposedly the moral anchor of chivalry, wasn't exempt from bending it to suit its needs. Knights were expected to serve as its defenders, yet justifiers would often encourage or overlook atrocities committed for the greater good. A knight might kneel to receive a bishop's blessing one day and torch a granary the next, all in the name of pious duty. Some chroniclers described knights who viewed the church less as a sacred institution and more as a powerful patron whose commands could be waived in exchange for favors or strategic advantage. And then there was the battlefield. There, the ideals of chivalry were tested and, more often than not, discarded entirely. Mercy? It depended entirely on the circumstances. Capturing an enemy knight often provided the chance for a lucrative ransom, and in those cases sparing them made sense. But if no ransom was possible, mercy quickly became an afterthought. Honesty, another supposed cornerstone of chivalry, also struggled to survive on medieval battlefields. Deception wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. A surprise ambush or cleverly manipulated retreat could turn the tide of a fight faster than any act of honor. But if knights truly embraced chivalry anywhere, it wasn't on the battlefield, but at tournaments. These events transformed bloodshed into something structured, almost performative. Rules governed the contests with surprising precision. An opponent without a helmet could no longer be struck, for example, and knights were expected to salute each other before charging into the fray. Here, knights showcased their discipline and restraint, bowing gracefully in defeat or claiming victory with dignity. It was a stage where chivalry was not just an ideal, but an almost theatrical performance. These tournaments provided the perfect balance, the danger of combat controlled and softened for the sake of honor. In many ways, the clash between the brutality of real conflict and the ceremony of tournaments exemplified the fragile nature of chivalry. The code existed in fragments, appearing where it could make knights look admirable or worthy of their storied image. Yet it rarely extended into the darker corners of their world. Every knight lived with the tension between the ideals they were supposed to embody and the realities of their day-to-day lives. Even the treatment of women, a cornerstone of the romanticized chivalric image, revealed these contradictions. Poetry and ballads hailed knights as protectors and admirers of noble ladies, their loyalty and love both pure and unbending. But these songs omitted the fact that women, particularly in noble circles, were often treated as little more than political bargaining chips. Marriage alliances were forged not in love, but in calculations of power and territory. And if a knight's affections strayed, romantic love was often fleeting and, above all, strategic. The chivalric reverence for women, much like the rest of the code, often boiled down to appearances, not action. Some knights wrestled with these contradictions on a deeply personal level. How do you honor ideals that seem impossible to uphold in the chaos of medieval life? Was chivalry something they were meant to believe in, or simply a script they performed when the right audience was watching? Many lived their days caught between those questions, unable to wholly reconcile their violent profession with the principles preached to them. And yet there were moments, small, fleeting, uncelebrated, when chivalry seemed less like a myth and more like a choice. not because of grand gestures or acts of extreme heroism, but because of restrained ones. A knight who chose not to destroy a poor household's meager grain stores during a raid. A squire who carried his wounded knight across the battlefield, exposing himself to danger. A simple, honest word spoken when a lie might have earned greater reward. These acts didn't make it into the songs and poems, but they were perhaps the truest test of chivalry. When no one was looking, when nothing could be gained, that's where the ideals truly lived, or didn't. In the end, chivalry served a purpose, even if it faltered constantly. It shaped public perception, present in the fabric of stories and ceremonies that kept feudal society orderly. Lords believed in the need for chivalry, and commoners held knights to its promises. And while knights often failed to uphold it, the idea of chivalry gave them something to strive toward, even if they fell short again and again. But with every deviation from the code came the question, was chivalry ever truly a guiding principle, or was it always just a convenient myth? Forget the stories of endless feasts and triumphant fanfare. Most days in the life of a medieval knight were far from glamorous. Even off the battlefield, their lives were defined by relentless duties, exhausting routines, and the constant weight of responsibility. For a knight, peace didn't mean rest. It simply meant trading the chaos of war for the grinding demands of estate management and local rule. Their mornings often began at daybreak, the sound of activity echoing across their manor. There was no lavish lie-in, there were fields to oversee, disputes among peasants to settle, and endless logistics to manage. Knights were not just warriors, they were landlords, administrators, and arbiters of justice. Life on the manor revolved around them. Each day, a steady stream of minor issues would demand their attention. Peasants needed approval for everything from marriage arrangements to grazing rights, and apprenticeships required their signature before they could begin. One knight might be approached to settle a squabble over property boundaries, while another might have to calm a dispute born from a bad harvest. These weren't dramatic moments of heroism, they were tedious and unending. Being a knight also meant keeping the wheels of their estate turning. The manor wasn't just a place to sleep or host feasts. It was an economic hub, producing grain, wool, and other resources that supported not just the estate itself, but also their wider feudal obligations. Knights directly supervised the collection of taxes, grain from the fields, coins from tenants, livestock for trade or slaughter. This wasn't a task they could ignore or delegate entirely. Resources had to be counted and recorded, quotas defined, and mismanagement dealt with harshly. The revenue ensured their own men were paid, their households maintained, and their obligations to their liege met. But this system was far from perfect. Miscalculations, theft, and inefficiencies were constant problems, with even trusted clerks siphoning off wealth where they could. Overseeing it all required vigilance, and mistakes could strain the delicate balance keeping their estate afloat. Their role as local enforcers of law was no less daunting. Villagers relied on knights, not only to protect them during wartime, but also to maintain order during peace. Delivering punishments, however, brought no satisfaction. The gallows in a knight's domain were rarely used, functioning more as a silent warning to remind people where ultimate authority lay. But punishments still had to be delivered: floggings, fines, or even exile for serious offenses. These were not decisions made with detachment. They were made with an awareness that overly harsh justice could provoke rebellion, while leniency could embolden troublemakers. Even religion, a cornerstone of chivalric idealism, added to the burden. Knights were expected to be protectors of the church, not only defending it in theory, but also investing in its maintenance. This often meant repairing chapel roofs, funding feasts for holy days, or contributing to the construction of altars or reliquaries. Attending Mass was part of a knight's daily rhythm, as much an obligation as farming or defense. But acts of faith often came in the form of money. Donations to cathedrals, monasteries, or local church officials allowed knights to display their piety publicly, sometimes compensating for actions that fell far short of chivalric ideals. And then there were the complications of managing the manor itself, maintaining the hall where they entertained guests, the barracks where their retainers stayed, and the stables for horses was a full-time challenge. Servants and staff brought their own headaches. The cook might complain about spoiled meat arriving late, while a stable hand might mismanage a shipment of hay. Every small problem found its way to the knight, a figure expected not only to lead in battle but also to act as a calm, decisive administrator in the mundane affairs of daily life. The manor's peace was fragile and rested on their shoulders, even in matters as small as a drunk servant who disrupted the evening meal. Hospitality, too, came at a cost. Hosting knights and minor nobles was a frequent obligation, and those visits were never casual social calls. They involved careful political balancing. Allies needed to feel welcomed, but status had to be maintained. A host who appeared too lavish might seem wasteful, while appearing too frugal could cause offense. Every detail mattered: how the guests were greeted, the meal they ate, the wine they drank. An insult, however unintentional, could have lasting consequences. Hosting wasn't an act of leisure, it was a performance, one fraught with subtle maneuvering. For all these outward challenges, knights also carried the burdens of the past. Many bore visible reminders of their time on the battlefield, scars that never properly healed, limp joints from injuries ignored for too long, and chronic pain that flared every time the weather turned or an unfortunate movement twisted an old wound. Sleep, too, was rarely restorative. At best, they had a bed made of straw or wool, their sleep interrupted by aches or patrols to ensure the manor was secure. At worst, battles replayed vividly in their mind in the quietest hours of the night, their faces clammy despite the cold. Evenings in the hall, which might seem the domain of revelry and relaxation, didn't entirely offer escape. A knight was still expected to be lord of the estate, even here, raising their cup when the time was right, laughing at the crude jests of drunken retainers and making small speeches to inspire loyalty. But the raw, uncontrolled noise, the clanging of goblets, the bursts of singing, often only masked the weariness running through their body. They performed their duties like a soldier in another kind of battle. Internal struggles held beneath the surface, hidden behind a forced smile. Perhaps the heaviest weight came from their moments of private reflection. These knights were human after all. They couldn't stave off the questions that crept into their mind after the hall quieted or during the brief stillness of a morning wind. Was the land they ruled truly theirs, or just held temporarily, loaned until their lord or king decided otherwise? Were they any better than the men they punished? And what of their experiences in war, the faces of those they had killed or failed to save? The songs had told them that glory would fill these spaces, that victory would occupy their thoughts. Instead, uncertainty lingered. Even in times of peace, knights found little solace. The ideals of greatness or honor, so often tied to their identity, were constantly undermined by the draining demands of reality. If a knight had ever dreamed of glory in their youth, that dream had been consumed decades earlier, left behind on a battlefield or in the monotony of daily life. Peace wasn't a time of rest, it was just another kind of struggle. But even this exhausting existence wouldn't last forever. The world was changing, and with it, the role of the knight was becoming obsolete. War was about to look very different, and the battlefield no longer had a place for the men with swords and armor. What happened to those who'd lived their lives defined by knighthood when the world began to leave them behind? The age of the knight did not end with a climactic battle or a sudden collapse. It faded slowly, edged out by the steady march of innovation and change. There was no shield strong enough, no sword sharp enough to stop the arrival of gunpowder. This new technology, with its cannon fire and musket volleys, reshaped the battlefield and left little space for the once dominant role of armored knights. Gunpowder does not care for bloodlines, formations do not care for honor. Warfare, once dictated by the strength and skill of men in steel, now emphasized precision, formations, and the collective force of armies. The single knight charging heroically into enemy lines became not a symbol of fear, but a clearer target for riflemen and artillery teams. In this transformed world, knights struggled to find relevance. Their expertise in close combat, their mastery of heavy cavalry tactics, even the craftsmanship of their armor, these things were no longer the backbone of military strength. Some knights attempted to adapt, exchanging swords for a council seat and becoming advisors or strategists. They learned to lead from the rear, relying on maps and messengers rather than raw physical prowess. But for many, this shift felt hollow. Your role, once essential, now feels ceremonial. Their lives had been built around the idea of action, the heat of the charge, the clash of blade against blade. Watching from the sidelines, no matter how wise their counsel, left them yearning for a world that was slipping away. Others turned to the responsibilities of landholding, retreating from the battlefield to focus on estates and the villagers who depended on them. In this role, knights became enforcers of peace rather than participants in war, maintaining order and keeping their lands productive. It was a quieter life, but not an easier one. Collecting rents, settling disputes, and organizing trade routes demanded an entirely different skill set. Their years of training with the blade rarely prepared them for the delicate balance required to mediate arguments between stubborn peasants or to outmaneuver neighboring lords in economic negotiations. It is not your victories that remain, it is your land, your people, and the fragile peace you hold together one decision at a time. This new role tested them in ways battles never had. Slow erosion of authority, endless compromises, and the daily struggle to hold a community together. Their greatest battle in this new era wasn't fought on the field or in their manorial courts. It was within themselves. They found themselves living as relics of a time disappearing before their eyes. Their once proud militaristic way of life was now romanticized but increasingly unnecessary. Whenever a younger squire asked about the old campaigns, their voices wavered between pride and grief. They might recount the tension before a tilt or the weight of their armor at dawn, those sensory details that never truly left them. Try to capture what it was like, they thought to themselves. The smell of the field after rain, the weight in each step before the charge. Their minds revisited those moments more often than they would admit, though the memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Many knights tried to preserve this fading world by writing their memoirs or passing their swords to sons and grandsons, artifacts of a legacy they still strained to understand. But no amount of storytelling or inheritance could bring the old ways back. The knight's charge, once a spectacle of terror and splendor, had become useless against rows of gunpowder-fueled artillery. A single cannon blast or musket volley dissolved the advantage knights had enjoyed for centuries. The age of the knight is ending not with a roar but with a series of sighs. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic final stand. Instead, the world moved forward in small, steady steps, each one carrying knights further into history, their place gradually solidifying into memory and legend. And yet, even as their swords dulled and their tactics evolved into the past, the image of the knight remained striking. The songs continued to praise their bravery as if they still rode into battle. The songs still praised the days of knights, but always in past tense. Chivalry, once an active effort that knights had fought to embody, began to transform into something much larger, much simpler. It became an ideal far removed from its origins, a symbol of noble resolve rather than a practical code to live by. The disconnect grew between the legends knights had inspired and the lives they had actually led. The truth, the exhaustion, the compromises, the failures, was often ignored, left unspoken in favor of the stories people wanted to believe. Still, legends aren't the whole story, and knights couldn't entirely escape their legacies. Those who survived long enough to retire from battle carried scars that marked them as veterans. Their old suits of armor, polished and propped on display in their great halls, were less symbols of glory and more artifacts of what had shaped their very identity. You were shaped by steel, but forged in the field. Every scratch, dent, and jagged edge told its own story. Beneath the weight of those memories was the knowledge of what it had cost. Every moment of combat had been measured not in victories, but in lives. True survivors, they knew, were shaped as much by what they endured as by what they lost. When their names finally faded from spoken memory, the myths outlived them. The world reshaped the knight into something timeless, a hero frozen in shining armor, all virtues and no flaws. And yet the real knights, the ones who had lived through wars, tended to people and grappled with their own contradictions, left something far more human behind. Knights may have fallen short of their ideals time and time again, but they persisted. Chivalry isn't about purity. It's about persistence, about falling short and rising again. In the end, that persistence was as much a part of their legacy as any battle or code they ever claimed to represent. The age of the knight may have ended quietly, but we still live in the shadow of their myths, and with those myths come questions, not just about knights, but about the world they represented and where we fit within it. We imagine their deeds in ballads and fictions, while forgetting the rough edges of the lives that inspired them. The knights themselves might have laughed quietly, humbly, knowing their stories were immortalized, even if those stories weren't entirely true. The knights we picture, gleaming armor, noble hearts, perfect chivalry, were never quite real. The knights who lived were survivors, shaped by struggle, exhaustion, and the quiet decisions they made when no one was watching. Their lives weren't stories of endless triumph, but tests of resilience in a relentless world. The songs glossed over the truth that chivalry wasn't about perfection, but about being decent in a profession built around destruction. So what other myths have we mistaken for truth? Let's keep uncovering them, because the reality of history, painful, raw, and human, is far more haunting than the legends we tell.